The crack of bone was a sound that echoed not in the air, but inside Grace Elizabeth Parker's skull. A sharp, splintering report that drowned out the territorial sun hammering on the tin roof of their shack. One moment she was holding out the day's meager earnings, $3 shy of the $5 her father demanded. The next, the heavy mining pickaxe handle he kept by the door swung in a blurry arc, and a supernova of white-hot agony exploded in her left forearm. Now that agony was her entire world. Silas dragged her stumbling and half-conscious into the dusty furnace of Tombstone's main street. The heat rose in shimmering waves from the packed earth, the air thick with the smell of horse manure, cheap whiskey, and baked dust. Her vision swam the weathered facades of the general store and the saloon blurring into a sepia-toned nightmare. "Stay put," Silas snarled, his voice a low, gravelly threat, thick with the morning's liquor. He shoved her against a splintered porch post outside Murphy's general store, her shoulder cracking against the wood. The pain in her arm, a mangled ruin, held together by a crude splint of fence slats and leather flared with such intensity that black spots danced at the edges of her sight. And looked pitiful. People pay for pitiful. He tossed her tin cup onto the boardwalk, where it landed with a hollow clatter that sounded like a death knell. Then he was gone, melting into the shadows of the nearest saloon, leaving her to collapse at the base of the post, a broken prop in his daily theater of desperation. Across the street, half concealed in the shade of the saddlery's awning, Lucas Riverbend went still. He had been in Tombstone for a week, quietly observing the town's rhythms, its currents of power and fear, all part of an investigation that had grown colder than a high desert grave. He was a tracker, a reader of signs left on the earth and in the hearts of men. And the scene unfolding before him was a sign he could not ignore. It wasn't just the casual cruelty of the man or the girl's obvious suffering. It was the specific angle of her arm and the way her small frame crumpled inward, trying to protect a wound that had already been savaged. The sight ripped through the veil of years, plunging him back into a memory he kept locked away. He was a boy again, hiding behind a horse trough on the reservation, watching a government agent strike his own sister, her arm, snapping with that same sickening crack. He remembered her silent scream, the helplessness that had filled his own small chest like a lungful of ice water. He had been a child then, powerless. He was not a child now. The memory burned away his professional detachment, leaving behind a cold, settled purpose. Some cruelties were not just signs to be noted. They were lines in the sand to be met. Lucas pushed himself away from the wall, his moccasin-soled boots making no sound on the dusty boardwalk. The sun was a hammer, the air a fire, but a different kind of heat was building inside him now, one that demanded action. Grace didn't see him coming. Her world had shrunk to the throbbing rhythm of her own pulse, the taste of dust on her tongue, and the shame that was a more constant companion than her own shadow. The predictable pattern of her misery had been worn as smooth as a riverstone. Mornings began with Silas's curses, his breath sour with the ghosts of last night's rotgut. She would fix him what little food they had, her one good hand clumsy and slow, earning a litany of insults for her efforts. Then he would march her to a designated corner, a new stage for her daily humiliation. The townspeople were her audience, their reactions a familiar script. Mrs. Henderson, the kindly woman who ran the boarding house, would sometimes press a cold biscuit into Grace's hand, her eyes a mix of pity and fear, as she scurried away, terrified of being seen by Silas. Reverend Miller had tried to intervene twice, speaking of Christian duty, and a father's love, only to be driven off by a volley of curses so foul they seemed to stain the air. Even the town's few decent men kept their distance, unwilling to interfere in what was grimly termed family business. But this man was different. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the blinding glare. He wore denim pants and worn leather boots like a settler, but the intricate silver and turquoise at his collar and the woven pattern of his shirt spoke of his true heritage. His long black hair was tied back with a beaded leather thong, and his face, weathered by sun and hardship, held a profound stillness. He stopped before her, his shadow offering a momentary blessed relief from the sun. He didn't look at her with the usual furtive pity or morbid curiosity. His dark eyes, intelligent and unnervingly direct, met hers, and in their depths she saw not judgment, but recognition. It was a look that saw past the grime and the torn dress, past the broken arm and the beggar's cup, and found the girl trapped inside. For a long moment they simply looked at each other across the gulf of her shame. A flicker of something long dormant stirred in Grace's chest. Not hope that was too dangerous a thing to feel, but a startling, terrifying sense of connection. He saw her. "Miss," he said, his voice low and calm, carrying the careful precision of one who had learned English as a second language, but mastered it as a tool. "My name is Lucas Riverbend." He knelt, bringing himself to her level, an act of respect so foreign it made her flinch. His gaze flickered to her arm, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I believe you deserve better than this." The words spoken so simply landed with the force of a physical blow. No one had told Grace she deserved better in years. Not her father, not the town, not even herself. She opened her mouth, but only a dry rasp escaped. Words had become a luxury, and the ones she needed now were buried under layers of fear. Lucas seemed to understand. He reached into his shirt and produced a small leather pouch. "I'm going to give you money," he said, his voice meant for her alone. "But I'm also going to offer you something more valuable." He tipped several heavy silver coins into her cup, the clatter loud enough to draw the attention of a few passers-by, creating the perfect illusion of simple charity. A choice. The uneven, shuffling gait of approaching footsteps made them both tense. Grace's fragile moment of connection shattered like glass. Silas. He was back far too early. His shadow fell over them, reeking of whiskey and rage. "What's this, then?" Silas demanded, his eyes bloodshot and mean, fixing on Lucas. He saw the silver in the cup, and his suspicion sharpened. "Some redskin bothering my girl?" The slur hung in the hot, still air. Lucas rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, turning to face Silas. He wasn't as broad as her father, but he possessed a coiled stillness that spoke of a different, more dangerous kind of strength. "I was having a conversation with this young lady," Lucas replied, his tone even, but with an edge of tempered steel. The emphasis he placed on lady was a deliberate rebuke, a stark contrast to Silas's possessive, "my girl." "She ain't a lady, she's a worker," Silas spat, jabbing a grimy finger toward Grace. "And you're interfering with her work. Now get before I call the sheriff." "I don't think the sheriff is who you should be worried about," Lucas said softly. What happened next was too fast to follow. Silas lunged his hand, reaching for the coins in the cup. Lucas moved like a striking snake. His hand shot out not in a punch, but with an open palm deflecting Silas's arm. In the same motion, he stepped inside Silas's clumsy reach, his body turning. And suddenly Silas was slammed back against the general store walls, gasping for air, with Lucas's forearm pressed firmly across his throat. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers who had begun to gather. "Let me make something very clear." Lucas said, his voice a deadly quiet whisper that only Silas and Grace could hear. "This young woman deserves respect. She deserves protection. And she deserves a life free from your poison." He pressed just hard enough to make Silas's eyes bulge. "If you ever lay a hand on her again, if you ever force her onto this street again, you and I will have a much longer, much less pleasant conversation. And it will be our last." He released Silas as quickly as he'd seized him. Her father staggered back, choking and rubbing his throat, his face a mask of shocked fury. And for the first time, Grace could remember genuine fear. Lucas turned back to Grace, his expression softening, but his eyes still held a dangerous fire. He ignored the gaping crowd, ignored Silas's ragged breathing. He spoke directly to her, as if they were the only two people on the street. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice clear and formal, now carrying across the boardwalk. "Your father is a coward who preys on the weak. But this town has allowed it. That ends today." He raised his voice, addressing the stunned onlookers. "All of you have seen this girl sitting here, day after day. You've seen her broken arm, and you have looked away." His accusation struck home. A woman in a fine dress, Mrs. Caldwell, the banker's wife, clutched her daughter's hand, her face paling with a sudden dawning guilt. The barber, who had been watching from his doorway, suddenly looked ashamed. From the edge of the growing crowd, a man with a tin star pinned to his vest pushed his way through. Sheriff John Behan arrived with the weary air of someone who preferred order to justice, and saw the two as mutually exclusive. "What's the trouble here?" Behan asked, his gaze settling on Lucas the outsider, the obvious source of the disruption. "No trouble," Sheriff Lucas said, turning to face him. "Just a simple question of law. Specifically territorial statutes concerning child abuse and criminal neglect." He gestured to Grace's arm. For the first time, Sheriff Behan, and indeed the entire town, seemed to truly see it. Not as a prop for pity, but as evidence of a crime. The crude splint, the unnatural angle, the pale swollen skin around it. "Is that true, miss?" the sheriff asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle as he turned to Grace. Silas, recovering his bluster, tried to intervene. "She's my daughter. How I raise her is my business. You gonna listen to this savage over me?" The silence that followed was damning. No one spoke in Silas's defense. All eyes turned to Grace. It was her crossroads, the choice Lucas had offered her. She could retreat into the familiar misery, accept the beating that would surely come tonight, and let this moment pass. Or she could speak a truth so dangerous it might destroy what little world she had left, in the desperate hope of building a new one. She looked at Lucas, at his steady, unwavering gaze that offered not pity, but strength. She looked at her father's face, twisted with rage and fear. And then she looked down at her own ruined arm, the constant throbbing monument to her suffering. The pain gave her the courage she needed. She met the sheriff's eyes, and for the first time in months, her voice was more than a whisper. "He broke it." She said the words clear and sharp as shattered glass. "He broke my arm with the pick handle 3 weeks ago. And he wouldn't take me to a doctor. He said it was better for business this way." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The raw, calculated cruelty of it, spoken aloud in the clear light of day, was undeniable. Silas's face went slack with shock, sent the last of his bravado crumbling to dust. Sheriff Behan's expression hardened. He took a step toward Silas, his hand dropping to the pair of handcuffs on his belt. The town's willful blindness had been broken, and justice, however reluctant, was about to be served. Grace felt a dizzying, terrifying wave of relief wash over her. She had jumped off the cliff. Now she could only pray she would learn to fly. The arrest of Silas Parker sent a tremor through the foundations of Tombstone's social order. The sight of Sheriff Behan snapping handcuffs onto the wrists of a white man based on the public testimony of his daughter and prompted by the intervention of a Navajo tracker was a spectacle that would be debated in saloons and parlors for weeks. Silas stripped of his authority, and his bluster unleashed a stream of threats and pitiable excuses, but the crowd was no longer listening. Their guilt had found its target, and Silas was it. "You can't do this," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "She's lying." He put these ideas in her head, but his words were swallowed by the murmur of the crowd, and their pity for Grace now curdling into outrage against him. Mrs. Henderson pushed through the onlookers, her face streaked with tears of shame and relief. "It's true, Sheriff. We all saw it. We were just too cowardly to say anything." Her public confession was an absolution for the whole town, and it sealed Silas's fate. As Behan hauled her father toward the jail, Grace felt a profound emptiness, where fear had lived for so long. It was a dizzying, disorienting freedom. Her legs felt weak, and she might have fallen if not for Lucas Riverbend's steadying hand on her good arm. "It's not over," he said quietly, his voice a low anchor in her swirling emotions. "This is just the beginning." He was right. The town's sudden concern manifested as a flurry of chaotic activity. Mrs. Caldwell was now insisting Grace be taken to a doctor immediately. The new physician, Dr. Matthew Richardson, a young man with a neat suit and an Eastern accent, was summoned from his office near the hotel. He arrived with a black leather bag and a professional calm that was a world away from Grace's desperate reality. "I understand there's an untreated fracture," he announced, his eyes taking in Grace's condition with a clinical but compassionate gaze. Grace looked at Lucas, her expression a mix of overwhelming gratitude and profound uncertainty. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice still raw. "Or what to do now." "You don't repay kindness," Lucas said simply, his dark eyes holding hers. "You pass it forward when you're strong enough. As for what to do now, you start with one step. Let the doctor see to your arm." That first step led to Dr. Richardson's clean, sunlit office, a place that smelled of antiseptic and hope. The examination was painful, but the doctor's gentle efficiency was a revelation. When he told her the bone had begun to set improperly and would need to be rebroken to heal correctly, a wave of nausea and terror washed over her. "I know it sounds barbaric," Dr. Richardson said, seeing the fear in her eyes. "But it's the only way to ensure you have full use of your arm again. We'll make you as comfortable as possible." The procedure was an ordeal of controlled agony, a fiery echo of the original violence. But this time, the pain was in the service of healing, not harm. When it was over, her arm was encased in a clean plaster, cast a stark white symbol of her new beginning. Mrs. Henderson, true to her word, had taken Grace in giving her a small, neat room at the back of her boarding house. For the first time in years, Grace slept in a real bed with clean sheets, at the silence of the house a comforting blanket after the constant drunken snores of her father. In the days that followed, a new life began to take shape. Lucas became a quiet, constant presence. He would visit in the mornings, bringing news from the sheriff about her father's case, and listening as she haltingly began to speak of her own dreams of books of learning, of becoming a teacher. He never offered easy comfort or false promises, but his steady belief in her was more valuable than either. He revealed little by little his own purpose in Tombstone. "I was sent by a consortium of Navajo leaders," he explained one afternoon as they sat on the boarding house porch. "Several of our people, prospectors with valid claims, have disappeared or died in accidents out in the Dragoon Mountains. The local law sees no foul play. I was sent to see what the law is missing." The revelation that Lucas was on a mission of his own made his intervention on her behalf seem even more profound. He had risked his investigation, his very purpose for being there for a stranger. Why, she asked the question she had longed to voice. "Why did you help me?" Lucas stared out at the dusty street for a long moment. "When I was a boy," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "I watched someone I loved suffer, and I was too small to stop it. I promised myself that if I ever saw such a thing again and had the strength to act, I would." He looked back at her, and the shared understanding of pain created a bond between them stronger than any spoken word. As Grace healed, she began to notice things she had been blind to before. She saw the subtle web of power that connected the town's most prominent citizens. At the center of that web was Mr. Alistair Thornton, the president of the Tombstone Bank. He was a man of impeccable manners and tailored suits, his voice a smooth, educated purr that masked a predator's coldness. Grace had seen him watching the confrontation with her father, his expression not of shock or pity, but of cold, calculating assessment. Lucas had noticed him too. "Thornton," he said one day, his voice thoughtful. "He's been buying up land. specifically old seemingly worthless claims all around the defunct Silver King mine. The name sent a jolt through Grace. The Silver King was where her father had worked as a foreman before the silver ran dry and his life had imploded. It was the source of all their prosperity and all their pain. My father still holds a small claim out there. Grace said the words coming out before she'd thought them through. It was my mother's. He never sold it, even when we were starving. He said it was all he had left of her. Lucas's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" he murmured. The threads were beginning to connect. The town, for its part, was trying to make amends. Women from the church brought her dresses and books. The mayor offered her a small job helping to organize town records, recognizing her clear handwriting and skill with numbers. For the first time, Grace had her own money earned through her own skill, not begged for with her own pain. It was a feeling so powerful, it was almost frightening. Her work with the town records gave her an unexpected opportunity. Buried in dusty ledgers, she began to see a pattern that mirrored what Lucas had told her. Dozens of small mining claims near the Silver King, many belonging to independent prospectors, some of them Navajo, had been transferred to a holding company owned by Thornton's bank over the past year. The transfers were often dated shortly after the original owner's death by accident. One evening, while sorting through her father's meager possessions from the shack, she found a small, locked wooden box. Inside, tucked beneath a faded photograph of her mother, a beautiful woman with Grace's own determined eyes, was a folded yellow document. It was a letter dated 10 years prior from Alistair Thornton. The letter was a blackmail threat. Her hands trembled as she read the elegant looping script. Thornton accused Silas of negligence related to a mine collapse at the Silver King a decade ago. A collapse that had killed a dozen men. A collapse, the letter implied, that had also killed Thornton's wife and young son who had been visiting the mine that day. "Your carelessness took everything from me," Thornton wrote. "You will pay for it. Not with money, for no amount could suffice. You will pay with your life. A slow, miserable decay. You will live under my thumb on my charity until you are nothing but a broken shell. And you will hold on to that worthless claim your wife so treasured as a daily reminder of what you lost, just as I must." The room seemed to tilt. Her father's descent into alcoholism, his cruelty, his self-destruction. It hadn't just been about losing his job. It had been a slow, orchestrated ruin conducted by the town's most powerful man. The beatings, the begging, the broken arm. They were not just the acts of a drunken brute. They were symptoms of a deeper, more sinister disease. Silas wasn't just her abuser. He was a puppet, and Alistair Thornton had been pulling the strings for 10 years. The mystery Lucas was investigating and her own private hell were not separate stories. They were one and the same. The discovery of Thornton's letter changed everything. Grace felt a cold dread seep into her bones, but beneath it, a new hard resolve began to form. This was no longer just about her father's abuse. It was about a decade-long vendetta, a web of deceit that had entangled prospectors, the law, and her own family. Thornton hadn't just wanted to ruin her father. He had wanted to possess him to orchestrate his every misery. And now Lucas's investigation threatened to unravel it all. She showed the letter to Lucas the next morning. He read it in silence, his expression grim. The pieces of his own puzzle clicked into place. The accidents weren't random. Thornton was eliminating anyone who held land he wanted, or perhaps anyone who knew the truth about the Silver King disaster. He's not just acquiring land. Lucas said, his voice low. He's erasing the past. What really happened in that mine 10 years ago, Grace? Grace shook her head, her memory hazy. I was only 7. I remember the sirens, the screaming. My father came home covered in dust, his face like a ghost. He never spoke of it again. Everyone said it was a tragic accident, a timber support that failed, an accident that killed Thornton's family and gave him leverage over the mine foreman, Lucas mused. It's too convenient. Their investigation took on a new urgency. They were no longer just seeking justice for Grace or for the missing prospectors. They were trying to unearth a buried truth that a powerful man would kill to keep hidden. Their search led them to the county records office, a stuffy room filled with the scent of aging paper and forgotten stories. Grace, with her newfound confidence and literacy, proved to be a formidable researcher. While the clerk was distracted by Lucas's questions about land surveys, Grace found the official coroner's report on the Silver King disaster. It was a thin file, surprisingly sparse, for an incident that had killed 14 people. The official cause was listed as a structural failure in Tunnel 4, caused by unforeseen geological instability. The foreman on duty was listed as Silas Parker. But tucked into the back of the file, misfiled and easily overlooked, was a supplemental geological survey conducted before the collapse. It warned in no uncertain terms that Tunnel 4 was dangerously unstable, due to Thornton's insistence on using a cheaper, faster blasting technique to get to a rich vein of silver. The survey strongly recommended ceasing all operations in that section. The recommendation was signed off on and ignored by the mine's primary investor, Alistair Thornton. He knew Grace whispered her hand, covering her mouth. He knew it was dangerous. His own family was there, and he let them go in. Greed makes men do monstrous things, Lucas said, his voice tight with anger. But this is something else. He blamed your father to cover his own crime. The truth was a far more twisted thing than they had imagined. Thornton's entire vendetta, the 10 years of torment he had inflicted on Silas, was built on a monumental lie. He had sacrificed his own family to his ambition and then destroyed Silas's life to silence his guilt. Their discovery did not go unnoticed. The next day, as Grace was walking back to the boarding house, a large, rough-looking man stepped out of an alley, blocking her path. "Mr. Thornton sends his regards," the man grunted. "He suggests that some things are best left buried. For your own health." The threat was unmistakable. Later that evening, a fire broke out in the livery stable where Lucas kept his horse. It was quickly extinguished, but the message was clear: they were being watched, and Thornton's warnings were escalating. The town no longer felt like a sanctuary. The whispers of support had been replaced by fearful glances. The people of Tombstone knew where the real power lay, and it wasn't with the sheriff or the law. They had to find more than just a 10-year-old report. They needed undeniable proof, something that couldn't be dismissed or buried. Grace remembered her father's drunken ramblings late at night when he thought she was asleep. He would mutter a name over and over again, a name filled with guilt and regret: Mulligan. Old man Mulligan saw it all. "Who is Mulligan?" Lucas asked. I think he was a blaster at the mine," Grace recalled. "An old prospector. He was Silas's friend. I haven't heard his name in years." A search of the town records showed that a one Jebediah Mulligan had sold his claim, a small plot adjacent to Silas's, to Thornton's company 2 years ago, and had promptly left town. There was no forwarding address. He had simply vanished. "Another loose end tied up by Thornton," Lucas said grimly. "But a man like that, a prospector, he doesn't just disappear. He goes where the rock is. He finds a new patch of dirt to call his own." Lucas's tracking skills, honed over a lifetime in the unforgiving wilderness, were now their only hope. He gathered what little information he could find on Mulligan. He was a hard drinker, favored remote, isolated claims, and had a fondness for the Chiricahua Mountains. It was a faint trail cold for 2 years, but it was all they had. Before they could leave, Grace insisted on visiting her father in jail. She needed to know what he knew. She found him shrunken and sober, the bravado gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed despair. She didn't show him Thornton's letter or the geological report. She simply asked him about Mulligan. At the mention of the name, Silas flinched. "Mulligan," He rasped, his voice hoarse. He tried to warn me. He saw Thornton give the order to use the extra blasting powder. He knew it was a death trap. Why didn't you speak up? Father Grace asked, her voice aching with the weight of a decade of needless suffering. Why did you let him do this to us? Silas looked down at his shackled hands. Thornton promised he'd see you cared for, he whispered the confession, a painful tearing sound. He said if I kept my mouth shut, he'd make sure you had a life and education. He said if I talked, we'd both end up in a ditch, and I was a coward. I believed him. The confession was not an excuse, but it was a reason. A twisted, broken, pathetic reason. He had sacrificed his own life and hers on the altar of a liar's promise. Grace felt a surge of pity so profound, it almost choked her. He was not a monster. He was just a weak man broken by a stronger, more ruthless one. She left the jail with a heavy heart, but also with a final piece of the puzzle. Mulligan was the key. Finding him was no longer just about justice. It was about reclaiming the truth of her own family's history. We have to find him, Lucas, she said, her voice filled with a new unyielding resolve. Before Thornton does. As they prepared to ride out into the mountains, a package was delivered to the boarding house for Grace. Inside was a simple new dress of deep blue cotton and a handwritten note. Every teacher needs a proper dress. Go with courage. MC. It was from Martha Clanton, the powerful rancher's wife and advocate for education, whom Grace had met briefly at a town function. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a blessing, a sign that they were not entirely alone in their fight. The journey into the Chiricahua Mountains was a descent into a harsher, more primal world. The landscape was a brutal masterpiece of jagged peaks and shadowed canyons, a place where a man could disappear without a trace. Lucas moved through it with a quiet confidence that calmed Grace's fraying nerves. He taught her to read the subtle language of the land and the meaning of a broken twig, a displaced stone, the flight of a hawk. After 3 days of tracking, following a trail of faint rumors from one isolated mining camp to another, they found him. Jebediah Mulligan was living in a crude dugout shelter, carved into the side of a sun-blasted hill, his only companion, a half-wild burro. He was old and frail, his mind clouded by cheap whiskey and years of regret. When he saw them, he reached for a rusty shotgun, his eyes wild with fear. "Thornton sent you, didn't he?" he croaked. "We're not with Thornton," Grace said, stepping forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm Silas Parker's daughter." The name settled him. He lowered the gun, his shoulders slumping. Over a fire of mesquite wood as the desert stars emerged in the vast velvet sky, Mulligan finally told his story. He recounted the events of the disaster in horrifying detail, Thornton's manic greed, his dismissal of the safety warnings, the final fatal order to use a dangerously powerful, explosive charge. "I saw it all." Mulligan rasped, his voice thick with guilt. Silas tried to stop him, but Thornton threatened him. After the collapse, Thornton paid me to keep quiet, gave me enough to disappear. I've been running from that ghost for 10 years. But Mulligan had more than just his memory. From a hidden lockbox, he produced a small leather-bound journal. It was Silas's foreman log from the Silver King. On the last page, dated the day of the disaster, was an entry written in Silas's own hand. "Thornton ordered double charge in Tunnel 4 against my direct warning and geological report. God help us all." And beneath it, a second signature corroborating the entry. J. Mulligan. It was the proof they needed, the smoking gun. Their triumph was short-lived. As they prepared to leave at dawn, they were ambushed. 2 of Thornton's hired men, the same thugs who had threatened Grace and set the fire, emerged from the rocks, their rifles leveled. They had been followed. A desperate shootout ensued. Lucas, using the terrain with expert skill, managed to wound one of the men. But in the chaos, Mulligan was shot. As he lay dying, he pressed the journal into Grace's hands. "Tell them," he gasped. "Tell them the truth." They escaped into the canyons, the journal clutched safely in Grace's saddlebag, but their situation was now dire. They were miles from Tombstone, hunted, and Thornton knew they had the proof that could destroy him. He would not let them reach town alive. "He'll expect us to ride for the sheriff," Lucas said as they took shelter in a narrow ravine. "We can't. He owns the sheriff. We need a different plan." A thought sparked in Grace's mind, born of desperation and a sudden chilling insight into Thornton's psychology. "The mind," she said. "The Silver King. It's his obsession. It's where it all began, and it's where he'll want it to end. He won't just want to kill us, Lucas. He'll want to bury the truth literally." Lucas looked at her, a new respect dawning in his eyes. She was no longer just a victim he was protecting. She was a partner, a strategist. "It's a trap," he said. "I know," Grace replied, her voice steady. "But a trap can be sprung two ways." The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a churning mass of gray and purple clouds that swallowed the horizon. A ferocious wind whipped down from the mountains, howling through the skeletal remains of the Silver King mine's headframe, kicking up sand that stung like 1,000 tiny needles. A sandstorm was coming, a desert gale that could strip paint from a wagon and a man from his senses. It was the perfect stage for an ending. Grace and Lucas approached the mine with caution, leaving their horses in a sheltered arroyo. The place was a ghost town, a monument to broken dreams and buried secrets. The foreman's office, where Silas's journal now lay hidden in a loose floorboard, stood near the main shaft, its windows like vacant eyes. This was their gambit to lure Thornton here to the scene of his original crime and spring their own trap. They didn't have to wait long. Thornton arrived not with his hired thugs, but alone, walking through the rising gale as if impervious to its force. He stood before them, his expensive coat flapping in the wind, his face a mask of cold, serene fury. "I must commend your resourcefulness," he said, his voice cutting through the wind's howl. "Finding Mulligan, very impressive. But it changes nothing. That journal will never see the light of day." "It's over," Thornton Lucas said, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip. "The truth is out." Thornton laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You still don't understand. You think this was about a mine collapse, about money." He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on Grace. "This was never about Silas. It was about his pride, his hope. It was about her." He gestured toward Grace, and his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that was more chilling than a shout. "My wife, my son, they were my world. And that fool Parker stood by and let them die because he was too weak to defy me. So I took from him what he treasured most. Not his job, not his reputation. I took his daughter. I wanted him to watch day by day as she withered. I wanted him to be the instrument of her destruction, to feel the exquisite agony of breaking the one thing he loved. Just as I did." The confession was monstrous, a twisting of grief into a decade-long symphony of cruelty. The sandstorm intensified the world, dissolving into a vortex of swirling dust and screaming wind. "But you..." Thornton snarled his composure, finally cracking his gaze, shifting to Lucas. "You interfered. You ruined the artistry of it." From the shadows of the collapsing structures, Thornton's 2 hired guns emerged, their rifles trained on Lucas and Grace. They were cornered. "The journal," Thornton demanded, holding out a gloved hand. "Give it to me, and I might grant you a quick end." "The journal isn't here," Grace said, her voice surprisingly steady. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but her eyes were clear and defiant. "Don't play games with me, girl. It's not a game," Grace said, taking a calculated step toward the foreman's office. "I left it with Sheriff Bean an hour ago. along with a sworn affidavit from Mulligan, which he signed before he died. It was a bluff, a desperate, wild gamble, but she delivered it with absolute conviction. For a fraction of a second, uncertainty flickered in Thornton's eyes. It was the opening Lucas needed. He dove for cover, his colt barking twice. One of the thugs cried out and crumpled to the ground. The world erupted into chaos. The second gunman opened fire, splintering the wood around Grace as she scrambled into the foreman's office. Thornton, enraged, drew a derringer from his coat and pursued her. The storm outside reached its peak, a physical assault of wind and sand. A groaning, tearing sound echoed from the main shaft as a massive timber in the headframe splintered under the strain. The old mine was coming apart. Inside the dusty office, a desperate struggle ensued. Grace retrieved the journal from beneath the floorboard as Thornton burst in. He lunged for it, his face a mask of madness. "You will not take this from me," he screamed. "You have it wrong," Grace cried, shoving a heavy overturned desk into his path. "It wasn't my father's fault. It was yours. I have the proof." She held up the journal. Silas's log. He tried to stop you. She opened it to the final damning page, the words, "A testament to a truth he had spent 10 years trying to bury." Thornton ordered double charge in Tunnel 4 against my direct warning and geological report. God help us all. Thornton stared at the entry, his own crime, written in the hand of the man he had tormented for a decade. The foundation of his righteous vengeance, the lie he had built his entire broken life upon, crumbled in an instant. It wasn't Silas's weakness that had killed his family. It was his own insatiable greed. His face went slack, the fury replaced by a hollow, bottomless despair. At that moment, the roof of the office groaned under the storm's assault. Timbers cracked. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Outside, Lucas had dispatched the second gunman and was now fighting his way toward the office. "Grace, get out. The whole thing is coming down." Thornton didn't seem to hear. He just stood there, staring at the journal, his life's purpose revealed as a tragic, self-inflicted sham. Grace saw her chance. She scrambled past him, clutching the journal, and burst out the door just as Lucas reached her. Behind them, with a sound like the world tearing in two, the roof of the foreman's office collapsed, followed by the screeching, catastrophic failure of the main headframe, which plunged into the mine shaft, taking the office and everything in it down into the darkness. Alistair Thornton, the architect of so much pain, was entombed in the very mine that had been the source of his sin. Grace and Lucas stumbled away, leaning on each other against the force of the wind the journal held tightly between them. They were battered, bruised, but they were alive, and they held the truth. The sandstorm began to subside, its fury spent, leaving a strange, quiet peace in its wake. The dust settled, revealing a landscape forever changed. In the aftermath, the truth as documented in Silas's journal was undeniable. Sheriff Behan, faced with the evidence and the death of the town's most powerful man, had no choice but to act. The investigation revealed the full scope of Thornton's crimes, and Silas Parker was exonerated for the Silver King disaster. Grace visited her father one last time in his cell before his release. He was a changed man, sober and broken, but with a flicker of his old self returning to his eyes. He tried to apologize, to explain, but Grace held up a hand. "I know about the blackmail," she said quietly. "I know what he did to you." She paused, the words heavy with the weight of years. "I do not forgive you for what you did to me. That was your choice. But the past, the part that belonged to Thornton, is over." It was not forgiveness, but it was closure. A clean break. A chance for them both to start anew separately. Silas was released and left Tombstone the next day, a man stripped of everything but a chance to live out his remaining years in quiet anonymity. The deed to her mother's small claim, the one Thornton had coveted, was now Grace's. It was a piece of rugged, unforgiving land, but it held a new meaning. It was not a symbol of tragedy, but of survival. Weeks later, Martha Clanton came to see her. She had heard the whole story and was deeply moved by Grace's courage. "The territory is establishing its first public school right here in Tombstone," Mrs. Clanton said. "And it needs a teacher. A teacher who understands what it means to fight for a future." The final scene of Grace's old life took place not in a courtroom or a jail cell, but on that small plot of land by the abandoned Silver King mine. Standing with Lucas, she looked not at the mine, but at the sprawling valley below. With the backing of Mrs. Clanton and the gratitude of the town, she did not sell the land. She donated it. Months turned into a year. Where the foreman's office once stood, a new structure rose from the desert floor, a simple, sturdy schoolhouse built of fresh pine and hope. On the first day of school, Grace Elizabeth Parker stood at the front of a classroom filled with the eager, shining faces of Tombstone's children. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, hopeful stars. On the corner of her new teacher's desk, she placed a small framed photograph of her mother, and the same one she had protected through all the darkness. It was a tribute to the past and a promise to the future. Her work had just begun,